Hey class, and welcome to lesson 5 on extended styling techniques using HTML and CSS. Today we're going to be learning how to use grouping elements, change the dimensions of a div block, and use the CSS box model to format our web page. So our web pages are going to start to get some structure to them. Up to this point, pretty much everything has been justified left and not in any boxes or any kind of layout. So this is where you're going to start learning how to build layouts using HTML and CSS. So grouping elements are used to set the HTML code into different groups for styling. Instead of needing to apply a class name to each individual element, you can wrap a group of elements in a grouping element, which can be called in the CSS code. The tags on their own have no value for the HTML code and are only useful when combined with CSS for styling. So there are two kinds of grouping elements, span and div. The span tag is useful for selecting a section of text. It can be used to distinguish a particular sentence or section from a paragraph, or even just a single word. So if you want something to be styled differently, you can use a span tag to wrap around it, even if it doesn't have its own tag. To use a span tag, simply add the start span tag at the start of the section and then the end span tag at the end. So for example, let's just say you had 3 paragraphs like we were doing earlier, and one of them you want to look different on the page or to be in a different part of the page. You would then use the span tag to wrap around it. And then you can call that span tag, or you can give it an ID or class name if you want it to be even more specific, and you can call that in the CSS to style it. The other option is the div tag. It is useful for grouping elements of different kinds together in the same styling group. So the div tag can be applied in the same way as the span tag, where the start tag begins the section and the end tag finishes it. So let's say you have a sidebar to your web page. You would wrap that sidebar, everything that's in the sidebar, in a div, and then give that div a specific ID, and then you could use that ID to style it. When using a span or a div tag, it is usually best to also give it an ID or class name for when it is called in the CSS, because usually it's going to be specific to that element, and you're not going to want all the divs on one page to look the same as you've styled it in CSS. Without a name, you could call all of the span tags at once, or all of the div tags, but not any one in particular. An ID or class name allows you to specifically call one div or one span to style. Span and div grouping elements also have another difference in the way that they format the objects they group. Span elements make inline formats. Div elements make block formats. So what does that mean? Block formatting, a new line is automatically created between groups. So it's like pressing return or enter on the keyboard, and you're starting a new line, basically, when you're using block formatting. Many web page elements are block formatted by default, such as headers, paragraphs, and lists. This keeps elements from running into each other on the page. Elements using inline formatting will not have an extra line added and will all be kept on the same line. Images and links on an HTML web page are a good example of this, as they can be added into a paragraph without needing a new line. We can use the block formatting property of div tags to blockify sections of a web page. If you wrap anything in a div tag, it will add new lines around it to separate it from other elements. The block as a whole can be formatted using CSS. So this might get a little bit confusing, but once you start the activities, you'll understand a little bit more about how that works. Okay, div dimensions, you can use the width, height, and overflow properties. So let's just say you created a box, okay, and you're using a div. So you wrapped the div tags around whatever was in your box, and you only want that box to take up 60% of the width of the web page. So like from here to here instead of all the way across. So you would call that div whatever it is, and if you created a class or an ID, you would use that. And then you would say width, the width property, colon, and then however you want to define the width. Usually you can use a percentage, or you can use specific pixel dimensions if you want to, but it's probably a better idea to use a percentage for width, unless you're defining the width of a specific image and you know the pixel dimensions. The height of a div box can also be adjusted by using the height property. The values for height can also be expressed as pixels or percentages. And then overflow, depending on the width and height chosen, the content in your div may or may not spill over the edges onto other content. Using the overflow property, we can adjust how the overflow is dealt with on the web page. So like this one, the paragraphs overflowed the title. So if you set the overflow as visible, any overflowing text will be shown on the page outside of the div area. This is the default overflow setting if none is set. If you set the overflow as hidden, then the content will be cut off at the lower border of the div and will not be shown. If you set the overflow as auto, then scroll bars will be added to the div so that all the content can be made visible while still staying in the confines of the div area. So it creates a box that has a scroll bar on the side, but it doesn't overflow into the next section. You can also define which orientation of scroll bars you want to use by using overflow X or overflow Y. Be aware of using scroll bars too much and avoid having scroll bars within other scroll bars. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to talk about with the layout of your web page is the box model, CSS box model. Margin, border, and padding. So let's think about this for a minute. So let's say you have a div box and it has some content in it here in the middle section. Okay, you can add different attributes to the box, the div, to create a different look. Okay, so typically, let's just say you had a paragraph here. Okay, and if you look at it in the browser, it looks like this. Okay. Now, if we wrap that paragraph in a div, then we have more control over what that paragraph looks like. And we might want to give it like a specific ID or class as well. But we'll just, since we have a really simple page going on here, we'll just do div, okay? So the border of our paragraph box can be styled using the border property. We can add some padding around our paragraph using the padding property. And if we want to add some space on the outside of our box so that it's not right up to the next element, we can add margin property. So the margin property, you usually add it in pixels. This creates a space of that many pixels around the four sides of the box. Okay, so let's do our box here. So let's say div. We're gonna style our box. So our box is gonna have a border of 1 pixel, solid, and we'll make it black. Okay. So let me see if that worked. Okay, yeah. So this is our box, our div. It takes up the full width of the page unless we define it otherwise. Okay. So let's define it with a width of 25% of the page. Okay. Alright, so here's my box. If I want to scoot it down and over so that it's not right up in the corner, I would use the margin property. So margin, if I just do margin, it's going to set them all four sides the same. So let's do margin 15px, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so it brought it down 15px, and it brought it in from the left 15px. And if there were other elements, it would also space them 15px from that. Okay, and then as far as padding goes, see how the T is right up next to my border? If I add padding, it's going to space this into my box more. So padding is the inside of your box. And it would be the same on all four sides there. Okay, so there's some padding, border, and margin. So you can adjust each of the four sides of the box differently by typing each value sequentially. The order is top, right, bottom, and left. Specifically, adjust one of the margins by using the margin right, margin top, margin bottom, or margin left properties, each defined by a pixel length. And then setting the margin property to auto centers the box on the page, adding as much margin as is needed to do this. So let me change this to margin auto, and you can see what that does. It centers the box on the page no matter what size of browser somebody's looking on. A border can be added around the content inside of the div box using the border property. There are three components to a CSS border: the size, the style, and the color. So for style, you can have solid, groove, double, ridge, dotted, or dashed. Those are the options. The color can be defined using any of the previously mentioned color systems, so you can use color names, RGB, or hexadecimal. And then when all of these elements are put together, you can construct the border property as follows. So this is the border shorthand. So you tell it the width of the border, the type of the border, and the color of the border. And then padding, if you add padding, it will increase the amount of space between the content and the border. Padding is defined using the padding property and a pixel value. So if you only want padding on the top or the left, you can do that as well. Padding top, padding bottom, padding left, padding right. And the padding is right next to the text. Okay? So that is how you style text. So now you're going to get to practice doing a page layout using CSS.